Margaret had always been the kind of woman who kept her world steady, even when life around her was shifting. At 62, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though inside she often felt the sharp edges of loneliness. Her husband, Richard, was reliable in many ways, responsible, hardworking, and devoted to his career. But in all those years of business trips and late meetings, he had built a life that often left her in the shadows. When he left once again for a week-long trip to Chicago, Margaret told herself it would be no different than the other times. Yet this time, the silence in the house felt deeper, heavier, almost unbearable. It was then her daughter called. "Mom," she said, sounding exhausted. "I have so much going on at work, and Ethan could use a change of scenery. Would you mind taking him for a few days?" Margaret's heart lifted. Ethan, her 16-year-old grandson, was one of the few bright sparks in her life. He was tall, full of curiosity, and though he sometimes wore the quiet seriousness of adolescence, she knew he had a kind and thoughtful soul. Without hesitation, Margaret agreed. She didn't want to keep Ethan cooped up at home. Instead, she decided to do something different, something she hadn't done in years. "How about we stay at the Lakeside Hotel for a night?" she suggested over the phone when Ethan arrived. His eyes widened. "Really? Just the two of us?" His excitement warmed her heart. They packed light, only enough for one night, and drove out of the city toward the small hotel that sat near the lake. It wasn't a grand place, but it was charming. The entrance was framed by flower baskets that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh lilies. Margaret signed them in, noticing how Ethan looked around with wonder, soaking in every detail. It reminded her of the days when she and Richard used to travel together in their early years before. Business had taken over his life. Their room was simple but welcoming. A large bed for Margaret, a smaller pull-out bed for Ethan, and a wide mirror hanging on the wall above a desk. The balcony overlooked the lake where the water shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Margaret stood there for a while, feeling the fresh air on her face. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite so heavy. "Grandma, this is nice," Ethan said, dropping his bag on the floor. His words, so casual, brought her an odd relief. She wanted him to have good memories of her, of these small moments they shared that evening. After they had unpacked, they went down to the restaurant. Margaret ordered fish with vegetables while Ethan asked for a burger. The waiter, noticing their playful banter, joked about how the young always choose the biggest meals. Ethan laughed, his voice ringing with genuine joy. And Margaret realized how much she had missed this sound the laughter of family that wasn't forced or hurried. Later, they returned to the balcony, carrying hot cocoa for Ethan and tea for herself. The lake was calm, dotted with reflections of stars. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. Then Ethan began to talk, almost as if the stillness of the night had given him permission. He told her about school, how he sometimes felt lost among his classmates, how he struggled to find where he belonged, how he worried that no one really noticed him. Margaret felt her chest tighten as she listened. His words echoed too closely to her own unspoken feelings. She had lived much of her life unnoticed. Standing beside Richard at countless dinners and parties, smiling politely while feeling invisible. It startled her that her grandson, at 16, could already sense that same weight. "You're not alone, Ethan," she said softly. "I've felt that way too, many times." He turned toward her, surprised, and their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition. A bond that felt deeper than grandmother and grandson. The night air grew cooler, but neither of them moved inside. Margaret found herself speaking more honestly than she had in years. She told Ethan how she once dreamed of being an artist, painting the world as she saw it. But how life had carried her in a different direction. She told him how sometimes, even when surrounded by people, she felt unseen. Ethan listened intently, his young face serious, as if he understood more than she expected. When at last they went inside, Margaret stood before the hotel mirror, adjusting the scarf around her neck. For a moment, she didn't see just her reflection, she saw the years she had lived. the dreams she had set aside, and the quiet ache of a woman who had given much but kept her own needs locked away. Ethan glanced at her in the mirror, and she wondered if he saw the same. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind turning over Ethan's words, her own confessions, and the strange comfort she had found in their shared honesty. She had thought this hotel stay would be a small adventure, a pleasant memory for her grandson. But now she felt something deeper stirring. There was a reason they were here, in this quiet place with the mirror reflecting more than just their faces. Margaret couldn't name it yet. But she knew. This trip was not just about spending time with Ethan. Something was waiting to be revealed. Something that might change how she saw herself, her life, and even her marriage as she closed her eyes. The night whispering softly through the open window. She thought, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect any of it. And with that thought, the weight of years felt just a little lighter. Morning sunlight spilled through the hotel curtains, soft and golden. Margaret stirred awake slowly, her body heavy from a restless night. She had dreamt of unfinished paintings, blank canvases, and voices calling her name but fading before she could answer. When she opened her eyes, she heard a faint sound. Ethan was humming. She turned her head and saw him standing at the mirror. He was buttoning his shirt carefully, tilting his chin from side to side, almost studying himself the way a painter studies a subject. Margaret watched silently for a moment. His reflection looked so grown up, his shoulders broadening, his jawline sharp, his eyes thoughtful. He was still her grandson, but in that quiet moment he looked older than his years. "Grandma," he said suddenly, without turning away from the mirror, "do you ever feel like people don't see you? Like they only see what they want, not who you really are?" The question stopped her breath. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Her instinct was to give the simple answer, something reassuring, something quick. But as she sat up, watching his reflection, she felt the weight of truth pressing on her chest. "Yes," she said finally. Her voice was soft but steady. "More times than I can count." Ethan glanced at her in the mirror, his brow furrowed as though he hadn't expected her honesty. "I feel that all the time," he admitted. "At school, at home. It's like people only notice the version of me they want to see, not the real me." Margaret rose slowly and walked to stand beside him in front of the mirror. They both looked at their reflections, two faces, one young and full of questions, the other older, lined with years of silence. She rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You're not imagining it," she said. "Sometimes people don't look closely. They miss what's right in front of them. But that doesn't mean the real you isn't there." Ethan nodded, but his eyes lingered on her reflection. "Do you ever wish someone would just see you?" Margaret's throat tightened. She thought of Richard, of all the dinners where she sat quietly beside him, her smile polite while conversations spun around her. She thought of the evenings when she waited for him to come home, only to hear about meetings and deals, but never about feelings. She thought of her own children, busy with their lives, assuming she was fine. And now, standing here with her grandson, she realized how deeply she had longed for someone to notice her not as a wife, not as a mother, but as herself. "Yes," she whispered, "I do." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, like two notes of a song that harmonized without effort. Then Ethan smiled faintly, his reflection softening. "But you see me, Grandma? And that means everything." Margaret's chest ached. She hadn't expected his words to reach her so deeply. She blinked quickly, fighting the tears rising in her eyes. No one had said something like that to her in years. To be seen it was such a simple thing, yet it felt like a gift. She reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "And I see you, Ethan, truly." For a while, they stood there, looking into the mirror as if it held more than glass. Margaret thought about how strange life could be, how sometimes the truths you bury for decades could resurface in the most unexpected places. She had come here to give Ethan a little escape, a change of scenery. But he was the one giving her something she hadn't realized she needed. Honesty. Later that morning, he went downstairs for breakfast. The restaurant was bright and busy with families. Ethan dug into his pancakes, talking about small things, music he liked, subjects he hated in school, how he wished he could travel more. Margaret listened carefully, smiling, though her mind kept circling back to his words from the mirror. Do you ever wish someone would see you? After breakfast, they decided to walk along the lake. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees and water. Children were chasing each other near the shore. Couples strolled hand in hand. And the sound of birds echoed across the quiet morning. Margaret felt strangely young walking beside Ethan. She hadn't been out like this in years, not for herself. Not without thinking of Richard's schedule or household chores, Grandma, Ethan said. Skipping a stone across the water, what did you want to be when you were my age? Margaret hesitated. She rarely spoke about her past dreams. I wanted to paint, she said finally. I wanted to travel, capture the world on canvas, and fill my home with colors. Ethan turned toward her, surprised. Really? That's amazing. Why didn't you? She sighed, watching the ripples spread across the lake. Life happened. Marriage, children, responsibilities. I told myself it was more important to give than to ask. Ethan shook his head firmly. But you're still you. You could still paint. You could still do the things you love. His words echoed inside her like a bell. She had spent so long thinking her time had passed, her chance gone. But here was this boy, her grandson, telling her otherwise with the conviction of youth. She didn't answer right away. But something inside her stirred a small spark she thought had gone out years ago. They walked for hours, talking, laughing, sometimes falling into comfortable silence. Margaret noticed how Ethan looked at the world with fresh eyes, noticing details she had long overlooked: the reflection of clouds on the water, the way the wind danced through the tall grass. His presence reminded her that life still had things worth noticing, worth savoring. By the time they returned to the hotel, the day was already leaning into afternoon. Margaret felt tired, but not in the heavy way she usually did. It was the kind of tired that came after living. After sharing something meaningful, that evening they returned to the hotel restaurant for dinner. Margaret dressed carefully, putting on a necklace she hadn't worn in years. As she glanced at herself in the mirror before leaving, she almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. She wasn't just a grandmother in that reflection. She was someone still alive with possibility. Someone who had been reminded that she mattered. At dinner, Ethan kept the conversation light, telling funny stories from school. But as Margaret laughed, she noticed a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. And yet, as they walked back to their room that night, Margaret couldn't help but wonder, when she returned home, when Richard came back from his trip, would she fall back into the same quiet invisibility? Or had something already changed inside her that could never be undone? She didn't know the answer yet, but deep in her chest, she felt it. This was only the beginning. The morning after their long walk by the lake, Margaret woke with a strange clarity. The night before, as she lay in bed listening to Ethan's steady breathing in the next cot, she had replayed his words over and over. You're still you. You could still paint. You could still do the things you love. It was so simple, yet no one had said that to her in decades. She had buried those dreams so deeply that even she had forgotten where they were. When she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, she no longer saw just the silver hair and tired eyes. For the first time in years, she saw the younger woman hidden beneath the girl who had once believed life could be more than schedules, routines, and responsibilities. She wondered if Ethan had unknowingly unlocked something inside her, something she thought had been lost forever. After breakfast, they decided to spend the day near the water. The hotel had a small dock where people could rent rowboats. Ethan's eyes lit up at the idea. Come on, Grandma, let's go out. She laughed nervously, reminding him she hadn't rowed a boat in decades. But his enthusiasm was contagious. Soon the two of them were pushing off the dock, the wooden oars dipping into the cool lake. The boat rocked gently as Ethan rowed, his movements awkward but determined. Margaret sat opposite him, the breeze tugging at her hair, the water sparkling all around. It felt like stepping back in time. She remembered rowing with Richard when they were first married, how he had teased her. When she couldn't keep her stroke straight, how they had laughed so easily together. That memory struck her with sudden force. When had they stopped laughing like that? "Grandma, you look far away," Ethan said, pausing with the oars. "I was just remembering," she admitted. "Your grandfather and I used to do this long ago. Life felt so different then. Do you miss it?" He asked. She hesitated. "I miss the feeling, the simplicity, the laughter." Her voice grew quieter. Somewhere along the way, we lost it. Ethan didn't say anything for a while. He just rowed, his gaze steady on the horizon. Then he said you could find it again. Maybe not in the same way, but in your own way. His words pierced her heart. Could she? After so many years of silence and routine, was there still space for laughter, for joy, for being truly alive? She didn't answer him, but she carried the thought with her as they drifted across the water. That afternoon, after they returned to shore, Margaret suggested they explore the town nearby. The streets were lined with antique shops, art galleries, and cafes. As they wandered into a small gallery, Margaret froze. On the walls hung paintings of lakes, skies, and quiet moments, the very images she had once dreamed of capturing. She moved slowly from one frame to another, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. Ethan noticed. "Grandma, you love these, don't you?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "I used to paint. Before your mother was born. Before life got busy." Ethan's eyes widened. "Why didn't you keep going?" She swallowed hard. "Because I thought my role was to take care of everyone else. I convinced myself my dreams didn't matter as much." He shook his head, his young face fierce with conviction. "But they do matter. You matter." Margaret had to look away, blinking back tears. No one had ever said those words to her quite like that. For so long she had defined herself by what she gave, not by who she was. Now, standing in a gallery filled with other people's creations, she realized she had silenced her own voice for too long. On the drive back to the hotel, the car was quiet. Ethan seemed lost in thought, and Margaret was battling emotions she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she could still choose a different path. But fear whispered in her ear, fear that it was too late. That Richard would never understand, that change was only for the young. That evening, they ate dinner in the hotel restaurant again. The room glowed with soft lights, the clinking of silverware mingling with low laughter around them. Margaret wore a scarf Ethan had picked out from one of the shops. It's a bright splash of color she would never have chosen for herself. When she caught her reflection in the window, she almost smiled at the woman looking back as they ate. Ethan asked questions about her past, what music she liked when she was young, who her friends were, what she had dreamed of before meeting Richard. Margaret found herself telling him stories she hadn't shared in decades. She talked about dancing barefoot on summer nights, about sketching by the river, about her first trip to New York when she thought the city itself was a work of art. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Grandma, you're way cooler than anyone knows." Laughter spilled out, surprising her. For a moment she felt young again, seen again. But when they returned to their room, and Ethan fell asleep quickly from the long day, Margaret sat awake by the window, staring at the dark lake. Memories rushed back, memories of Richard's absence, of her children growing up, of the countless times she had put herself second, third, or last. She thought about the mirror, about Ethan's words, about the paintings in the gallery. Something was changing inside her. She could feel it, like the slow shifting of the earth before a new season begins. She realized that maybe her life wasn't ending with quiet routines. Maybe it was waiting for her to begin again. In some small but meaningful way, as the clock ticked past midnight, she whispered aloud, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice. "It isn't too late. It can't be too late." The words felt like a promise to herself. The morning sun streamed into the hotel room, warming the walls with gold. Margaret woke before Ethan, her heart strangely light. The words she whispered the night before, "It isn't too late still," echoed in her chest like a quiet rhythm she couldn't ignore. She dressed and slipped out quietly, walking to the dock. The lake was calm, the mist rising in delicate waves. She stood there, breathing in the stillness, feeling alive in a way she hadn't in years. By the time she returned, Ethan was awake, his hair messy, his face eager. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "To the lake," she said, smiling softly. "Just to think." He studied her closely, as if noticing something had shifted. "You look different, happier." Margaret chuckled. "Maybe I am." She ruffled his hair and added, "Let's make today special. Our last full day here." They spent the morning wandering again through the town. This time, Margaret lingered at the art supply shop they had passed before. She picked up a set of paints, her hands trembling slightly as if holding something forbidden. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "Grandma, you should get them." Her lips parted. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said firmly. "You told me once you used to feel free when you painted. Don't you want to feel that again?" Margaret's heart swelled. Without another word, she bought the paints and brushes. As she carried the bag, she felt a strange joy bubbling inside. It wasn't about the tools, it was about the choice. For the first time in decades, she had chosen something purely for herself. That afternoon, they sat by the lake. Ethan skipped stones across the water while Margaret unpacked her paints. She hesitated, staring at the blank canvas pad. The white space felt intimidating, like an unopened door. Then Ethan called Grandma. "Just start. Don't think too much." She dipped the brush into blue paint and swept it across the page. The motion was clumsy, her hand unsteady, but as the color spread, something inside her loosened. Stroke by stroke, she painted the rippling water, the pale sky, the green line of trees. With every line, she felt the weight of years lifting. Ethan leaned over her shoulder. "That's beautiful. It's just a beginning," she whispered. But inside, she felt the truth's every beginning mattered. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner, they returned to their room. Ethan quickly fell asleep, worn out from the day. Margaret sat by the window again, painting by the soft glow of the lamp. This time she painted not just the lake, but also a figure, a small boy, skipping stones, his face turned toward the horizon. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear dropped onto the page. The door opened suddenly. Richard walked in, his suitcase rolling behind him. Margaret froze, brush in hand. "She hadn't expected him back so soon, Margaret." His voice was surprised. "You're painting?" She swallowed, her heart racing. "Yes, I used to. I'm trying again." He looked at her, then at the painting, then back at her. His expression softened in a way she hadn't seen in years. "I remember when you painted," he said quietly. "You were always happiest then." She blinked, startled. "You noticed?" "Of course I noticed," he said, his voice heavier now. "I just thought life was too busy. I didn't know how much you missed it." Margaret set down the brush. For a moment, the room was filled only with Ethan's soft breathing in the background. "Richard, I can't keep living only in routines. I've given so much of myself to everyone else, but I forgot who I was. I don't want to lose her forever." Richard moved closer, his hand brushing hers. "Then don't. Maybe it's not too late. For you, for us." Her chest tightened. For years, she had felt unseen, unheard. But now, standing there with him, she saw the truth. Perhaps both of them had been lost in the noise of life. Perhaps they could find their way back, not to who they were, but to who they could still become. The next morning, Margaret stood by the mirror, the same one that had haunted her days ago. She stared into her reflection, but this time she didn't search for the younger woman she once was. She simply saw herself, silver hair, lined face, steady eyes, and for the first time, she accepted that this woman was enough. When Ethan stirred, he smiled sleepily. "Grandma, you're smiling at the mirror again." "Yes," she said softly, "because I finally see myself." Kay packed their things ready to return home. As they walked out of the hotel, Margaret carried her bag of paints. It wasn't just luggage. It was a promise. On the drive back, Richard reached across the seat and took her hand. It felt awkward at first, unfamiliar after so many years of distance. But when she looked at him, she didn't see the man who had been away too often, or the man who had let silence grow between them. She saw the man she had once laughed with on a rowboat. The man who had loved her when they were young, Ethan, sitting in the back, noticed. He smiled but said nothing. Some things didn't need words. When they arrived home, the house felt different. Margaret placed her paints on the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across them. She picked up a brush, dipped it into color, and began again not just on the canvas, but on her life. She knew there would still be routines, responsibilities, quiet stretches of time. But now she also knew there would be color, laughter, and moments just for herself. She wasn't disappearing into the background anymore. She was stepping forward one brush stroke at a time. Margaret looked at Richard, at Ethan, at the life waiting ahead. She whispered more to herself than anyone else. It isn't too late. It never was.